If you're worried about what people will think about your comic, whether that the drawings are bad or the writing is bad or that it's a cheap knockoff of insert comic here, then you've come to the right place, because in this video we're going to talk about why you feel that way and 2 promises I want you to make today that will make you invincible to your own negative self-talk and unwanted criticism from others. So why are we so anxious about other people's opinions of our comic? Well, we are all under a social phenomenon known as the spotlight effect. And like most things in life, social media tends to make that worse. The spotlight effect is a social phenomenon where we overestimate just how much people care about what we look like, how we sound, what we say, and what we do. We all imagine a spotlight on us as we go through life. But the reality is that most people have their own spotlights on them, so everyone is more concerned with what they're doing than what you're doing. But knowing that fact, as I've done for several years now, isn't necessarily going to stop you from assuming that other people are going to think negatively about your work. And the reason we do that is because of something called anchoring. Because we have unfiltered access to our own thoughts and feelings about ourselves and about our work, we tend to anchor our perception to these ideas, and we often struggle to consider alternative views. For example, we know how difficult it was to make our comic. We know how many times we had to redraw that particular panel. We know how much we had to rely on references and 3D models to help with accuracy and efficiency. We know how often we questioned ourselves and thought negative things like, I'm a bad artist or I suck at writing. And we keep or anchor these thoughts and feelings when we're considering how other people will also think about our comics. Because we felt negatively or we've been overly critical about our work, we kind of assume that others will too, because that's our natural perception of our own work. Except the vast majority of people aren't going to think that, because they don't have any of those thoughts going into your comic. In fact, most people who try out a new comic want it to be good, and so their thoughts are anchored in positivity. How many times have you seen a movie or read a webcomic where you've given it X number of minutes or X number of episodes before you make a judgment? It's because you want it to be good, and you want to give it as much time and as many episodes as possible to prove that it's good to you, because you don't want to feel like you're wasting your time. Nobody actively goes and watches bad movie after bad movie or reads bad comic after bad comic. This is another reason why perfectionism in the comics that you create is a complete waste of time. The majority of people aren't looking for perfectionism in the comics that they read, and they'll often either forgive or completely miss any of the perceived flaws that might be there. Because on balance, it's good enough to hold their attention. For example, I like pro wrestling. Stay with me, this will make sense. I think, like comics, it's one of the most versatile art forms, and it can make you feel all sorts of emotions, positive or negative. I'll ignore the sometimes bad writing, bad acting, the mistakes or botches in matches, because on balance, it's still a product that I enjoy in spite of its flaws. Apart from Roman. Roman is flawless. Now, that being said, there is a very good chance that you're sabotaging the perception of your comic thanks to the spotlight effect, and you might not realize that you're doing it. In one of the earlier seasons of Bake Off, which I think is called the Great British Baking Show in America. Why? I don't know. Anyway, there was this baker, I forget her name, who was presenting whatever she had just made to the judges, and one of the first things she said to them was, "I'm sorry." They hadn't even tried it yet, and she was apologizing to them. Well, they tried it, and Paul and Mary loved it. And she would eventually go on to win the whole competition. But one of the things that they said to her was to never tell anyone that you're feeling bad about what it is that you've done, because then they'll expect it to be bad and it will color their view of it. A lot of us do this in our works too. We may write something about our work on social media like, I'm a beginner, or I know this isn't the best, but, or it's not perfect, but I know I do that, so this is a reminder to myself to not do that anymore. By saying these things to caveat your comic or whatever it is that you're sharing online, you're basically saying, this comic isn't good, but I would really appreciate if you read it anyway. And you know what most people will do if you do that? They will either not read it at all, which is probably the majority, or they'll read it expecting it to be bad, and instead of forgiving or ignoring the flaws, they're going to start looking for them, because they want to prove their initial thought going in, which is negative. So they're going to look for the negatives, because you gave them negatives. So the first promise that I want you to make to yourself right now is that you will never downplay or speak negatively about your work publicly, under any circumstances. You don't have to say that what you've made is great or perfect or anything like that, unless you genuinely feel that way. But you can say things like, I had a lot of fun making this comic, or I learned a lot by making this page, or whatever it is that you've made. Just positive statements only. And if you can't think of a single positive thing to say and only negativity is in your head, just post the comic with zero context. Nothing is better than negativity. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be critical of your own work, because you absolutely can. The only way that we can really improve is by recognizing our weakest areas and trying to strengthen them. But do that in a safe space with a group of people that you trust and where strangers or potential readers aren't going to see. A few of the channels in my Discord are intended exactly for this, where people can post their work in progress or ask questions without the fear of being judged or thought lesser of. And if you have a person or group of people that you trust, then absolutely vent your spleen and talk to them about how you're feeling about your comic. Because although you shouldn't do it publicly, you also shouldn't bottle it all up inside. Because they'll start to become overwhelming and you'll start to believe the negativity as fact. But what if you've published your work or bits of your work and you're getting strangers telling you that the comic is bad, or that they've pointed out the flaws that you know are there? Does that mean that your negativity was correct? Or maybe they've criticized a part of your comic that you actually were really proud of, and that's got you thinking that maybe you were wrong about those positive aspects. And if you were wrong about the positive aspects, then maybe you were right about the negative aspects. Maybe you do suck after all. Well, no. And here's why. People make negative comments on the internet for all sorts of reasons. I've had a few negative comments on several of my videos over the last few years. Maybe the person is really stressed and they just happen to take their frustration out on you. Maybe they simply don't understand how difficult it is to make comics and assume that everyone should be at the level of the top players in the genre. Maybe they feel insecure about their own skills and the only way to feel better is to put somebody else down. Or maybe they've just misinterpreted the story or the art. And maybe, just maybe, they're a cunt. When, not if, you get your first negative comment, the first thing you're going to want to do is respond. Your comic is your child, and you may be able to criticize them, but if anyone else does, then you're going to fight for their honor to the death. But the thing is, this is the internet. When have you ever known someone to back down from their position? It's very, very rare. Most people double down on their original thought, regardless of whether they've been proven wrong or not, because they don't want to admit that they're wrong online. So responding to them is completely pointless. Another reason why it's completely pointless is because most people who leave negative comments on a comic or a video or whatever it is online rarely go back to the scene of the crime. They'll arrive, make a judgment, and then move on to something else that they can judge. So they'll likely not see your response anyway. Maybe you're worried that other people will read that comment and agree with it. Well, let me ask you, do you do that? Do you watch something or read a comic and check out the comments and have your opinion changed just on those comments? I rarely, if ever, do that. I was racking my brain trying to think of an example where that has happened for me, and I genuinely can't think of anything. But despite that, I do understand that fear. But the only time where a comment might change the perception of your readers is if the commenter is a well-respected figure in your field. In the UK, the most respected film critic is Mark Kermode, and so his opinion matters to a lot of people. But even then, I'm pretty sure he didn't like the first Pirates of the Caribbean film, and I watched that in the cinema 8 times. Great movie. Anyway, the point is, responding to negativity is not worth your time or your energy, regardless of what is being said and by who. And this is the second promise that you need to make yourself. Do not respond to negativity. Either block, delete, or ignore. They are your only options. But does this mean that you should ignore criticism? No, but, and this goes for people who give and for people who receive criticism. This is my public message to you. If the artist hasn't asked for criticism, do not give it. And if the artist has asked for criticism, do not take it personally. Remember that most people do not think what you think that they're going to think. Most people aren't clawing over your work and tearing it to shreds. Most people who are willing to read your comic are more likely to like it than not like it. And for those who don't, that's a good thing. That's absolutely fine. They can just move on and try and find something that they do like. We're not going to allow their negativity to sabotage our work. And we're all going to collectively promise ourselves not to talk negatively about our work and not to respond to unwanted negativity from others. Okay? Good. Because negativity doesn't help in any situation, and it can be so bad for some of us that it stops us from even completing our comics, let alone worrying about whether people will like the finished story or not. And if you're in that position now, then watch this video next where I talk about how you can improve your work process to complete your comics consistently.